Today's encounter where Jesus comes to meet his friends at the Sea of Galilee is unique to John's gospel. And it reminds us that John is a very different gospel from the other three. Each of the evangelists chooses to end his gospel in a different way. Matthew gives us the story of the Great Commissioning, and Mark similarly does this, but in a little bit shorter version of it. Luke has the ascension, and he tells it both in the gospel and then again in Acts, which is a reminder to us that the Gospel of Luke is just the first half of a larger work of gospel and Acts. But John does neither of these things. Instead, John tells a story, and he tells an engaging, delightful story that packs a punch. And the fact that these stories are all different reminds us that we cannot create correspondence, a seamless version where they all come together, and impose a chronology on this. We know there is a span of time between the resurrection and the ascension, and Luke places that at 50 days. But other gospels make it seem much quicker, and Paul's going to write later about all the appearances that are not even recorded. So we really don't know, and the fact that we don't know is fine, I think. We have to accept the gospel, and we have to accept these stories, particularly on their own terms, remembering that they are part of a larger story. But then we are invited to kind of come to these stories with our what ifs. So today we leave the inner doors, the locked up upper room, and we go to the great outdoors, and we return to familiar territory. And my gosh, if there was ever familiar territory to Jesus and his followers, it would be the Sea of Galilee, where they spent so much time, as did we, as readers of the story, as followers of Jesus Christ. So it is here that Jesus comes once again to his disciples. And as with all of our encounters, we enter the story through the eyes of a particular character. And today's character is Peter. Jesus gave him that name, Petros, and he nailed it when he did, because to be named Rock captures the personality of Peter. He is rock solid, this one. He is dependable. In today's parlance, we talk about a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. That would be Peter. He is without guile. Even in his impetuosity, which we see, he has a great heart. He cares deeply and passionately, gives himself to things wholeheartedly. But if we want to understand Peter, we have to see him within his context. And his context is the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee, also known as the Lake of Gennesaret or Lake Tiberias, is not a sea by normal standards, but rather a very large lake, and at 13 miles long and 8 miles across. By way of comparison, the total area is about the same as Lake Washington is in Seattle, but in a very different climate, and at 209 meters below sea level. The Sea of Galilee is the lowest freshwater lake in the world. And this was where Peter and his friends were fishermen. It was a tough trade, made for tough men. The fish that these men were catching was mushed, or Tilapia galilea. Today it is known as St. Peter's fish. They did a lot of this fishing in the winter, the rainy season, and because it was so wet, they themselves were often wet as they rowed to and fro and hauled in heavy nets, lifted their catches, sometimes diving into the water to retrieve their nets. So they often had to strip down. Typically they worked all night, and they stopped at dawn because the nets themselves could be seen by the fish in the light of day. So daybreak meant
the end of fishing, successful or not. And after a long night's work, they had to row to shore, offload, take care of the fish, if they had any, and carefully wash and hang their nets to dry. For the nets were made of linen and would rot if left wet. In a little town like Capernaum that made its living from the sea, a rhythm followed, wherein the women hushed the babies in the morning and kept quiet so that the men could catch up on their much-needed sleep.
We're going to see this pattern reflected in many of the gospel stories that come from the Sea of Galilee. As we listen to this story from John, we might also notice that it's similar to an earlier story from the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus and Peter, then Simon, had first met. Let's start there.
Once while Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd pressed in on him to hear the word of God, he saw 2 boats moored by the side of the lake. The fishermen had disembarked and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to pull out a short distance from the shore. Then, remaining seated, he continued to teach the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and lower your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have been hard at it all night long and have caught nothing. But if you say so, I will lower the nets." Upon doing this, they caught such a great number of fish that their nets were at the breaking point. They signaled to their mates in the other boat to come and help them. These came, and together they filled the 2 boats until they nearly sank. At the sight of this, Simon Peter fell at the knees of Jesus, saying, "Leave me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For indeed, amazement at the catch they had made seized him and all his shipmates, as well as James and John, Zebedee's sons, who were partners with Simon. Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men." And with that, they brought their boats to land, left everything, and became his followers.
Now Peter knew the sea well enough to know that there was no natural explanation for what had just happened. And he went to that place in his heart where, as a devout Jew, he had dared to hope. And he was all in. And thus began one of the most remarkable companionships in all of history. In the next 3 years, Peter would experience incredible highs and incredible lows. A partial list would include walking on water, proclaiming Jesus as Lord, experiencing the transfiguration, being rebuked by Jesus, "Get thee behind me, Satan," protesting his feet being washed by Jesus, us falling asleep in the garden, cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant, and following and then denying the arrested Jesus. And it is against this last experience that today's encounter needs to be compared. So let us continue to set the scene by going into the gospel itself, the first 3 lines.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. After these things, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, who was called Didymus, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We are also coming with you." They went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing.
As with some of our earlier encounters, I'd like to offer you yet another midrash as story interpretation to help us imagine what was going on in Peter's mind.
The glint of the rising sun upon the waves, the gentle roll of the boat beneath my feet, the rough tangle of net between my fingers. This is good. This is something I can be sure of, something that never changes. Never change. Yet everything is changed. How can the sun rise? How can the birds sing their morning praise? I don't understand. I don't understand any of it. What happened? What will happen? I don't even understand who I am anymore. When I don't understand, I fish. Even that this morning escapes me. The fish escape me. But so does the peace. And the turmoil inside of me, it's fueled, I know, by my own failing. I do not know the man. Are Judas and I so different after all? How could I betray he who was never anything else but true? He who was everything to me.
So with this in mind, let us continue with the gospel story, which will be told in 3 parts.
But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish to eat, do you?" And they answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find the fish." So they cast it, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but only about 200 cubits away, dragging the net full of fish. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already made, and fish placed on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have now caught." So Simon Peter went up and hauled the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples ventured to inquire of him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus revealed himself to the disciples after he was raised from the dead.
Like Jesus drawing alongside the disciples on the road to Emmaus, this scene also invites us to step inside and walk around, to warm ourselves by the charcoal fire, see the dancing flames, hear the crackle, smell the grilling fish, and further to just appreciate the hospitality of Jesus and share in the joy of the risen Lord. But there is another purpose here. Jesus is about to offer Peter the chance to deal with his shame and his guilt. Now, all 11 disciples share to some degree in the guilt they must feel, with a possible exception of John, depending on which gospel you are using. But Peter's situation is unique because with his denial, it had been predicted. And it happened to Peter alone. And of course, he and Jesus had a very unique and deep bond. So the shame Peter feels is commensurate in response to that. Plus, it is in keeping with his very earnest personality.
It is at the Last Supper that Jesus explains what is about to happen. And Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Where I go, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow later." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a cock shall not crow until you have denied me 3 times. And then John tells us each of the 3 denials after the arrest in the garden. Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. Now that disciple, we can take that to be John, was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest, but Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought in Peter. The slave girl, therefore, who kept the door, said to Peter, "You are not also one of the man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the slave and the officers were standing there, having made a charcoal fire, for it was cold and they were warming themselves. And Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they said therefore to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He had denied it and said, "I am not." Then one of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter therefore denied it again, and immediately a cock crowed. So let us pick up again by the shores of the Sea of Galilee and see how Jesus extends to Peter the opportunity to receive his tender mercy. Listen for patterns in this story compared to the denial. The repeating pattern of 3, details like the charcoal fire, and let it speak to you. Now when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my lambs." He said to him again, a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." Truly, truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to put on your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will put your belt on you and bring you where you do not want to go. Now he said this, indicating by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had said this, he said to him, "Follow me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Every time I read this gospel, I am struck by how gracious Jesus is in extending to Peter the opportunity to say out loud 3 times, "I love you," to make up for the 3 times that he denied him. I don't know if you've ever had the occasion to really be confronted or deal with your own guilt and be given the opportunity to do differently. But I remember a time in my own life, my sister Ellen had a poster in her home that said, "The holiest of holidays are the silent anniversaries of the heart." And I have an anniversary. It's not on any calendar, but I remember it every year when it rolls around, and I feel glad when it's here. I remember a time in that anniversary. It was an ordinary day. I was at my morning prayers, and for whatever reason, a verse I'd read many times before, but in that moment, it convicted me. I mean, I was gobsmacked. I realized then that in my heart, I harbored so much resentment towards someone that, truthfully, it could be said that I was breaking the 5th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." I wanted no good for this person whatsoever. And I mean, I had my reasons. I could justify it, and I could get other people to agree with why I should feel the way I do, how normal, natural that is. But that was not the point. The point was that in my heart, that's what I was doing. That was my sin. And when Jesus made me aware of what I was doing, that was when I could choose to do differently. Because truthfully, I didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to be like that. But it's only when you have both the combination of God's grace and your own awareness that things can be changed and you can do differently. And every time that anniversary rolls around to this day, I just reflect on how gracious God is to be free of that. It's only when we become aware of our own sinfulness that can really appreciate how great is God's forgiveness. So let's go back and ask the question, why does John choose to end his gospel with this story? John does not have any great commissioning, so there's not that sense of being sent forth. So what is the message in the story? How is John going to propel the reader into the future? In choosing to tell a story instead of an event, John places Peter at the center of the story, and Peter stands in our place. Remember, there's a second half to this dialogue between Peter and Jesus. "Do you love me?" and "Feed my sheep." Jesus not only asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" but in response to Peter's professed love, he gives him a directive, "Feed my sheep." 3 times. Because it is in the nature of love, it is the essence of love, that love should lead to action. We can think of it kind of like a marriage. I remember Father John used to say to engaged couples, if all you say is "I love you," but you don't do anything, what good is there in that? Or if you do kind things and are considerate
to one another, but you never remember to say, I love you, don't expect that marriage to last. So there is the both and that is necessary of word, but also of deeds. And Peter's being told, feed my sheep, should remind us of yet another directive. We can go back to that second encounter between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And while we do not have the threefold, the repetition, the back and the forth pattern is still there in saying, do not cling to me, no me tangere, you must let me go, then go tell the others. So the act of love that is in the first part of that, no me tangere, you must let me go, is followed by a directive of what it is she is to do, to go and to tell the others. Each of them, Peter and Mary, are sent. They are to go, they are to tell, they are to feed. This is their Great Commission, and they stand in our place. There is still John's version of a Great Commission.
I love this about John, that he chooses to end his gospel with this story. There's a small episode, a little transition piece that talks about Peter's death, and then Peter asks about his good friend John, what about this man? And Jesus says to him, if I want him to remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Then John goes on to identify himself and say, this is the disciple who bears witness to these things and wrote these things, and we know his witness is true. And then, almost by way of aside, comes John's closing line, the bookend to his beginning line, in the beginning was the Word, where he reached back into the start of Genesis to say, this is a new Genesis, a new beginning with Christ. He makes all things new. For John, everything is done on a cosmic level. And then he ends very simply with a note from himself saying, and there are also so many other things that Jesus also did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. The Gospel of John. So, we've gone through most of these post-resurrection appearances. The only thing left for us next time is the Ascension, and we will be arriving there just as the church is celebrating the Feast of the Ascension, whether on Thursday or Sunday. And it is my hope that this too will take on new meaning for you. I think a lot of things have built up to the Ascension. Thank you for staying the course. I hope that Easter itself has taken on new meaning for you, and we'll see you next time. Alleluia.